We talked about the ocean, we've talked about the plates, we've talked about the waves, we've talked about the water. We're now going to start doing all the living things in the ocean. We're starting with the smallest living things in the ocean and going to the biggest. So we're going to start with viruses, and then bacteria, and archaea, and then work our way up into protists, like algae and that sort of stuff, and seaweeds. And then we're going to get to plants. Ocean. The ocean does have some plants living in it. And then we're going to get to animals, which are all the include the fish and the whales and the mollusks and the shrimp and arthropods and all sorts of things like that. We're going to go out and do a plankton drag. We're doing that on Thursday. What is it, Friday? No, it's Wednesday. We're doing that tomorrow. Yeah, we're going tomorrow to do a plankton drag. We're going to drag the nets. It's last period tomorrow, isn't it?
I couldn't tell you.
Last period tomorrow.
Yes.
So we're going to drag the plankton nets. So get ready tomorrow to go out to Epworth Dock again, and we're going to drag the plankton nets, and we're going to bring them back to the lab and see what we catch. Okay? A little tiny organism floating around in the water. Isn't that fun? It's called plankton. You ever seen SpongeBob? You know plankton?
Well, wait, what's today?
Little organism. We're going to catch some of that. So we're going to start with the Microbial Ocean Life, which is chapter 13. And I forgot to make the PowerPoint on this, so we're just going to follow the book along here. But we start with viruses, marine viruses. Now when we use the word marine, you know what we're talking about? Water. So viruses in the water. So what do we have there? We have these things. These are some of the viruses that are found in the ocean waters. Viruses are very, very tiny.
Got a shot, Tony.
They're smaller than cells. So if this were a cell, a eukaryotic cell, a virus might be this big. You can fit a lot of viruses inside of cells. And what a virus does, it's a little package of DNA that can invade a cell and squirt the DNA into the cell.
Squirt.
And the cell's dumb, it doesn't know what's going on. It'll read the DNA that's on these instructions. And those you know what those instructions, what the DNA says?
Kill yourself.
Do those? It's close. No, he's close.
Produce more of me.
Produce more viruses. And the cell will start making more viruses following those instructions.
They actually do that.
And you're right, George. I don't know why everybody's laughing, but after enough viruses are made, the cell bursts open and releases the viruses, killing itself.
There's some fiends.
So, viruses can be harmful to cells, and the viruses are then released into the water, and they float around in the water until they get in another cell. Now, viruses are specific for certain cells. So there are marine viruses that only infect marine plants, or that only infect marine algae, or that only infect marine bacteria, or that only infect marine animals. So it depends upon the organism what the virus is. There aren't any viruses in the ocean that specifically infect humans. Humans don't live in the ocean, so they wouldn't have anywhere to go. Now, there probably are some viruses in the ocean that maybe could get in a human and mutate and affect a human, but that's a very, very rare thing. So these are what some of the viruses look like. The amount of viruses in the ocean are actually large. You wouldn't realize it because you can't see them. But here it says there are approximately 50 million viruses per milliliter of ocean water. So if you were to go take a spoonful of ocean water
And drink it.
that's about 40 or 50 milliliters.
So if you drunk.
So in that spoonful there's about 250 million viruses. Now if you drank it, the viruses would get inside you, but they can't infect you because your cells are human cells and they don't have a way to get inside human cells. So they would just die inside your system.
Where is a mutated virus?
Then it could possibly affect.
What about my
But
stomach?
the odds of that are so slim that it's probably not going to happen.
Maybe that's other zombie.
Plus, your digestive system is highly acidic. So if you just swallow the seawater, it would be, everything in it would be broken down by the acid that's in your digestive system. So that's another reason it probably wouldn't affect you.
All right, I
But you
know.
don't want to go drinking seawater.
I know, like our stomach is coated with like the mucus or whatever.
Yeah.
So like that acid, could it really like burn through stuff?
Yeah, well, it could. It's acidic enough to kill cells, and it could burn through cells. Now, it's not like acidic enough to burn through metal or anything like that. It's not like the acid that you see in a movie like Aliens, where you just stick a piece of metal in there and it dissolves. But it'll slowly dissolve things. Yeah. Yeah. Especially organic things like food. But mainly it's there to kill any organisms that you happen to eat, like bacteria that are on your food. When you take a bite of a sandwich, you're not just getting the sandwich. There's a bunch of bacteria on the sandwich. Your digestive system kills them.
That's awesome.
Isn't that great? Thank your digestive system. Ah, this picture's not showing up.
I don't think you need.
None of them? What is wrong with my picture?
French toast.
I can show you what the pictures want to show you. So, virus infecting.
So, you know how tired I'm not good. So,
No, it's not actually.
you look exactly.
No, I don't. I bet it's really light.
He's a little bit more handsome.
Okay, so
And
this
swole.
picture right here.
I didn't know.
Listen, this picture right here is a bunch of viruses infecting a cell. Oh, there's the cell. There's a bunch of viruses on the edge. And the little line that goes there connects the virus to the cell, and it can inject the DNA through that little tube. That's a whole bunch of viruses.
That's what that really is.
So these things are floating around in the ocean. Now the next thing it talks about is cyanobacteria, and it looks like the picture on that's not working. I'll have to go through this and fix the picture.
Water.
Water splash.
But if you want to see what a cyanobacterium looks like,
I feel like Have you heard that song Water by Ecuador? It's so funny.
so this stuff right here is cyanobacteria. All this green stuff.
They look like worms.
Cyanobacteria are little green bacteria that usually hook together to make what's called a filament. A filament is a string or a strand. And you can see these are cells, these are bacteria. Every little line you see there, see this up close.
Water.
Every little line you see there is a cyanobacterium. And these things float around in the ocean, and they do photosynthesis. What's that?
Lobo.
They're in a little boat.
In a little boat?
Lobo.
It's basically like a little pod.
Well, yeah, all these things are strung together, so that cell is stuck to that cell, is stuck to that cell, is stuck to that cell, and they form a string. And that string is very thin, though. It's almost microscopically thin, and it floats around in the ocean, and it makes the ocean look green. If you ever go look at the ocean in a boat, there's a hint of green, and that's because these things are floating around everywhere in the ocean.
Isn't that pretty
It's
nasty?
on the surface, and they take sunlight, and they do photosynthesis, and they make food for
What
themselves.
about where the water's blue? Is there just less of it?
There's less of it. And some places have more of it, and some places have less. Yeah. So usually the water looks kind of greenish blue if you look at it, and that's because of these things floating around it. Cyanobacteria. Can you say cyanobacteria?
Cyanobacteria.
All at the same time?
Cyanobacteria.
Oh. There we go. Cyanobacteria. Cyan is a greenish color, that's why they call it that.
Saying.
Where their populations are high, the waters have a green tint, which can be measured by scientists.
Can you pick it up?
Cyanobacteria, sometimes they form strands that are real long, and you can't pick those up. It looks like a green line. I get a sample of cyanobacteria for the regular biology class to look at, but that's not until second semester. But when I get them, you can come see. They're little green, little tiny green lines. You put them under the microscope, and you can see them bigger. What's that? You remember those little green lines? So that's the bacteria that are in the ocean. The prokaryotes. Now, not all of the prokaryotes are cyanobacteria. Some of them don't make their own food. They consume other things. So there's a lot of little tiny bacteria floating around in the ocean. Millions of them per square milliliter, per cubic centimeter. Which is also called a milliliter. So again, one spoonful of ocean water doesn't only contain like 250 million viruses. It can also contain a couple million bacterial cells. Some of them cyanobacteria that make their own food. Some of them regular bacteria that have to eat. And some of them called Archaea. Archaeans are kind of a different sort of prokaryote, a different sort of bacteria that Archaea appear to inhabit extreme habitats, such as hydrothermal vents in the deep sea. And some of these Archaea are just floating around everywhere. So there's actually two groups of prokaryotic cells. Maybe I'll learn this in regular biology.
Yeah.
Back in the day.
Prokaryotes are divided into two groups. One's called the bacteria, and one is called the Archaea. And if you don't know anything about cells, they just both look like really tiny, I mean, even with our microscopes, you can barely see them. Really tiny cells. But these things have a different chemistry than these things. There's more of these things out there than these things. But you do find a lot of these things around hydrothermal vents and places where there's no oxygen. And these things like to live in weird places. But there's also these things in normal places.
Where do you find the viruses?
Viruses are also everywhere in the ocean.
But like, are they bacteria?
No, they infect bacteria and they infect Archaea. Viruses aren't technically living.
Right.
Viruses are like little containers of DNA that can infect these things.
Right.
So the bacteria include the autotrophs are cyanobacteria.
Wait,
Y'all know what the word autotroph means?
Something that does
automatically.
Makes its own food.
Make your own food. So cyanobacteria are the autotrophs, and then they're the heterotrophs. They can't make their own food, and there's a whole bunch of them in the ocean too. And you know what heterotrophs like to eat?
Autotrophs.
Autotrophs. The heterotrophs will eat the cyanobacteria. So you have a little food chain there going on in the ocean. So small you can't even see it. And the Archaea sometimes get eaten by the heterotrophs, and the Archaea can eat them, and the Archaea can eat them. So there's a whole bunch of different groups here. You can take a whole course on this in college and study all the different types of bacteria and the types of
Archaea
types
can
of
eat
Archaea.
heterotrophs?
Archaea can eat the bacteria can eat the Archaea. The only things that don't eat are the autotrophs. They make their own.
They just run.
Often they don't run and hide, they just float. And sometimes they get eaten, but they multiply quickly, so the ones that don't get eaten multiply, and there's more of them. As long as the sun keeps shining, we're good to go. If the sun goes out, we got a problem. Because then these things can't make their own food, then they die out. These things have nothing to eat, and they die out. They're the bottom of the food chain.
Archaea would still be alive though.
Archaea have to eat too.
Oh, you're right.
So they die out too.
So what would still be alive that
Not
moves on?
much.
What about the thermo whatever thing is?
Yeah, the things down at the bottom of the ocean that live off the chemicals. The chemosynthetic organisms wouldn't be bothered.
Alright.
They'd be like, oh really, the sun went out? Meh. Don't bother us. the sun's not going to go out. But this has happened in the history of the Earth. A meteor impacts the Earth, throws up a bunch of dust, and it blocks out the sun for years. And most of this stuff dies, and the food chains die out, and all the big creatures die out. That's why all the dinosaurs died out.
I'll still be here.
Which you're big. You would be, it'd be little guys like me that don't have to eat as much.
Hide in the crevice.
That make it. Yeah.
My body would be able to eat itself for a little while.
You might go into a series of, but you do have a lot of muscles, so your cells would use that as food, and you'd be able to live a long time off of that, but you get smaller.
They get really small.
Yeah.
You wouldn't be small anymore.
All right, let's talk about diatoms. Now, diatoms are little single-celled creatures that make a shell for themselves. And here it shows a whole bunch of different types. Diatoms are the most numerous type of plankton in the ocean. Now we have this general term that you have to learn. It's called plankton. Can you say plankton?
Plankton.
All at the same time?
Plankton.
Plankton is just a word that means cell floating around in the ocean. And it could make its own food. It could be something that's eaten. If it makes its own food, it's called phytoplankton.
Phytoplankton.
Phytoplankton. All at the same time?
Phytoplankton.
And those are autotrophs. They make their own food. And then you have zooplankton or zooplankton.
Zooplankton.
All at the same time?
Zooplankton.
And that eats. That's plankton that have to eat. But plankton are just little tiny cells floating around in the ocean, some of them making their own food, some of them having to eat. But they're not prokaryotes, they're eukaryotes. And there's lots of groups of them. One of them is called the most numerous is called the diatoms. So when we drag our plankton nets tomorrow, you're going to catch a lot of these in the net. And we'll take them back, we'll look at them, and a lot of them look round like, a lot of the ones we have here are round like this. They're little round, brown looking things.
What kind of plankton was plankton?
I don't know, from SpongeBob? He had little, didn't he have little cilia sticking out of his body, little hairs?
He had 2 antennas.
Antenna? I'm not sure what he
And
was.
1 eye.
Anyway, you can probably Google it, what type of...
I think he's those things that
What
like,
type
you see
of
them on the
plankton is
rocks here.
plankton?
You see them on the rocks. Those little tiny.
Yeah, but that's not plankton. That's
I think
like
that's what he is.
that's like an arthropod. Yeah,
His name was Plankton.
yeah.
I think that's
He was a
representing,
plankton.
Tony.
He was a plankton.
You're cool.
Yeah, that's an arthropod. That's called a sea louse. So these things, they float around in the ocean. They have some oil inside their shell. They make a little glass shell. That glass shell is made of silica, and they have oil inside, and they kind of float, and they do photosynthesis. They're phytoplankton. And they provide food for lots of things in the ocean. These things can multiply and make more of themselves and grow new shells. And when they die, the shells sink down to the bottom of the ocean and become part of the sediment at the bottom of the ocean. Now, sometimes the bottom of the ocean is uplifted by geological forces and becomes, part of the land. And all that sediment dries out, and we call it Diatomaceous Earth because it's got a whole lot of these diatom shells in it. And industries will take this Diatomaceous Earth, and they'll use chemicals and machines to break up all the rock and get the little diatom shells out. And the diatom shells are put into abrasives like toothpaste and cleaners.
What?
Have you ever taken toothpaste and kind of chewed on it a little bit?
Yeah.
It's a little bit rough in there. You're chewing on diatom shells.
What?
Toothpaste isn't completely smooth. They put these little shells in it so that it'll clean the bacteria off your teeth. Yeah, they're like little pieces of glass, but they're not sharp.
What about when you crunch them with your teeth?
Even when you crunch them with your teeth, you're not really breaking them. Yeah. They're too small.
It's
Sand.
Plankton is.
What? What is he?
He's a krill.
He's a krill. Yeah, that's not a plankton. That's actually an arthropod. Yeah. It's good. That's good to know.
False advertising.
That's good to know.
I'm suing.
There we go. Diatomaceous Earth. Can you say diatomaceous Earth?
Diatomaceous Earth.
That's land. That's rock that has a lot of
They look like
diatoms.
sand.
Yeah, these things look like little sand grains if you look at them under the microscope. They're real small.
They're putting sand on too.
Video of diatoms?
Yes.
Can you see the little things moving
What's
around
moving?
around them?
Oh, what is that?
Those are bacteria. There's a diatom. Little black-shelled organism.
No.
Isn't it exciting?
What is he doing?
He's crawling around.
What is he going through?
Yep, there's a little, I don't know what those are. We can see these under the microscope. When we do our plankton drag, we'll get some of these. Most of them don't move, but some of them can.
What if you stuck your finger under the microscope?
It would be way bigger than
Looks like an eye.
this. Way bigger than these. So you could fit thousands of these on your fingernail. These things are tiny.
That one looks like
So that's the diatom, and the little dots around it that you see that are moving around, those are bacteria. Those are prokaryotes. See that little dots moving around? Those are, all those little things are tiny prokaryotes. Some of them move and some of them don't.
That's me.
Wasn't that a good diatom video? Diatom videos normally...
Life in a drop of water.
Go back to the book. Now, there's another group called Dinoflagellates. And dinoflagellates look like this. And they're also phytoplankton. They do photosynthesis. And they come in many types. They all have flagella. That's why they call them flagellates.
Mr. Willis,
Yes,
don't they glow?
they do. A lot of these have bioluminescence, which means, why is it doing that? Which means it, stop.
Yeah. For real?
They have bioluminescence, which means they contain little bacteria in them that can glow in the dark. And you can see these things in the ocean. If you go to the ocean at night and you drag your arm through, sometimes it'll light up if there's enough of these things
Me and
around.
Sam conducted an experiment this summer on Sea Island where we did that.
And did it work?
Yeah, I really did.
Yeah. So,
I didn't know what it was.
so that's these things that are in the water. They're floating around there too. They're microscopic, so you can't see them. But if there's big concentrations of them, they'll light up. And these things also cause a phenomenon called red tides. Have you ever heard of a red tide? That's a whole bunch of these dinoflagellates in an area, and they can cause sickness because if a fish swims through this, those organisms, if there's too much of them and it's the right type, they release a little bit of a poison and it can kill the fish. And red tides have actually been known to kill people. They'll close the beach if there's a red tide around. It happens about every 10 or 15 years there'll be one.
Wait, what?
Yeah, red tides. You never heard of red tides?
No, I haven't.
Red dot.
Yeah.
Heard of black tide.
Oh man, this video's unavailable.
Are you kidding me?
Red tide.
Roll
That was a red tide video. Let's see the bioluminescence video.
Perhaps you've seen these videos online. They appear to show glowing blue waves sitting on the shores of some alien beach, but this is actually San Diego. To find out exactly what's going on here, we talked to marine biologist Michael Latz at the Scripps Institution of Oceanography at the University of California, San Diego.
Well, this video shows bioluminescence that is coming from a single-celled organism called a dinoflagellate. And in this case, there's really high concentrations of one species, which is called Lincolidium polyhedron.
According to Latz, this organism is known to form algal blooms commonly called red tides.
These red tides are just a natural part of the ecosystem, but the challenging thing about them is that we don't understand why they occur, and we can't predict when they're going to occur. We know that there's a red tide when we actually see it. You look out on the ocean and you see during the day that the water is discolored. So it looks kind of reddish or brownish in color, but during the night, the organisms in this case are bioluminescent. And this is light that they emit from the cells.
In the wild, bioluminescence acts like a car alarm, going off at even the slightest bump from a predator.
The response by the dinoflagellate is like a reflex. So if it feels a certain amount of mechanical stress, then it's going to respond with light.
So whether it's a predator going in for a midnight snack, or the crashing of waves, a surfer, or a curious kayaker, the results are the same.
I thought you said they're
Insanely
poisonous.
cool, glowing water.
Some of them are,
While
some of them
red
aren't.
tides can be toxic to people, this one is harmless.
You may not want to go in the water because there's a lot of organic material and you may view that as noxious, but certainly it's really a delightful thing to go swimming at night. Please go with somebody else to be safe, but to swim in it and just observe the bioluminescence for yourself.
We're discovering these unburied gas and that's bioluminescent waves. Explain.
But how come it wasn't in the water when I went in the water? It was only on the shallow. It was only on like the shore.
shallows. Goes when mechanical activity.
What's the question?
When me and Sam went, it only happened like
Was he gonna swim?
in the like on the sand.
On the sand?
The water would go on the sand and then go out and we'd like run our hands across the sand.
I don't know. It should
The
be
sand,
it should
the
be in the
sand
water.
here glows at night. Like,
So-
Oh, for real?
Show that out.
Because of the moon.
No, I'm looking. I've been on the.
Sometimes, listen, sometimes the red tides are dangerous, and sometimes they're not. It depends on the species. So, and some are bioluminescent, and some aren't. It depends on the species. So, there's different types out there. You need to know the foraminiferans, and that's a fun one to say. Can you say foraminiferan? The foraminiferans are little cells that create a white-colored shell made of calcium carbonate. Now, calcium carbonate shells are white, just like the shells of like any seashell you'd find. It's the same substance. But these things are microscopic, or almost microscopic. They're about the size of a sand grain. You probably saw some of these when you were looking at sand under the microscope. You may not have realized it when you were looking at it, but some of the sand grains had patterns in them and such, little holes and things in them. And those were probably foraminiferan shells. So these foraminiferans, they grow. They aren't phytoplankton. They're zooplankton, and they eat other things. And they actually have, most of them have little holes in their shell that they can reach out part of their cell and grab something and pull it in and eat it. And they just float around in this shell. And when they die, the little shell sinks to the bottom of the ocean and becomes part of the sand. Biogenous sediment. Calcareous ooze.
Okay.
And this material can, in some places, the foraminiferan shells can be so great that it colors the sand white. And if you've ever heard of the White Cliffs of Dover, which is not showing up here, so let me get another picture here. The White Cliff. I don't know why my pictures aren't working in this chapter. I think I'll check it out. But the White Cliffs of Dover. White Cliffs of Dover. Some images of those. They're these beautiful white cliffs.
White.
Oh, shoot.
And
Chill out.
what that is,
So
it
white.
goes all the way. What that is sediment that was once at the bottom of the ocean. And geological processes uplifted the bottom of the ocean and pushed it above, and then some of it broke off and fell back down, and you're left with just this cliff. And you can see it's how wide it is. That's trillions of these foraminiferous shells
So you can slide
that made up the sediment that built up over millions of years at the bottom of the ocean, and then that whole thing got pushed
Where
up.
is that?
This is in England, and they call them the White Cliffs, and you can see how
What
wide
would you
it
do
is.
if you touched the side of it? What would happen?
It would just, it feels like chalk. And as a matter of fact, they make chalk out of this. If you take that rock there, break off some of the white pieces, and take the rock, you can carve it into a piece of chalk. And if you're writing on a chalkboard, what comes off the chalk are the little shells. Little foraminiferous shells are in the little marks. That
How did they discover that so long ago?
Some ancient guy said, I want to write something, and grabbed a piece of that rock, and he wrote it on another rock, and was like, hey, that works. And said, hey,
Rock.
don't come in my cave, or I'll kill you. And he wrote that, and no one could read then. So he's like, well, that didn't work. But you get the point. So it's funny, these foraminiferous shells are what make up chalk and what make up the White Cliffs of Dover. Now, there's another group called Radiolarians. That's also fun to say. Can you say Radiolarian?
Radiolarians.
Radiolarians have shells too, but the shells aren't made of calcium carbonate. They aren't white. The shells are made of silica, which is glass. And they help make up siliceous ooze, which is part of the sediment in the ocean. And you can see all these little organisms. They live inside these glass shells, and they have all kinds of different shapes here. Radiolarians. So their shells are glass. They're clear, and they float around and eat other things. So they're zooplankton because they eat other things. Different than the clear-shelled diatoms. The clear-shelled diatoms are phytoplankton. So we remember the diatoms earlier? Let's go back and look at the diatoms so we remember what those are. These things, these are glass-shelled too, but they make their own food. Different from the radiolarians that are glass-shelled. Where's the radiolarians? There's the radiolarians. They're glass shell, but they have to eat. Again, these things are microscopic. They're floating around in the ocean. When they die, their little shell floats to the bottom and makes up part of the sand. Makes up part of the siliceous ooze.
Delicious.
Then you have your ciliates. Your ciliates are cells that have cilia sticking out. Why is this thing's acting up today? There's a ciliate. Cells that have cilia hanging out. So here's the cell, and it's got a little shell that it's built for itself. And these are the little cilia up at the top. Cilia are little hairs. Do y'all remember that from biology?
Yeah.
Little hairs that stick out of some cells, and the cells use the hairs to move like this and pull a water current toward them and make the water go in their little mouths, and they eat. So if they're cells with cilia, again, they're microscopic, you can't see them, but they're in the ocean, and a lot of them are just sitting on the ocean floor, sticking their little cilia out, feeding. And a lot of them are floating around in the ocean, sticking their little cilia out, feeding. And so there's a lot of ways to live. But if they do have cilia, guess what we call them? Ciliates. A lot of times the ciliate lives in a shell that it often makes up of sand grains. And we call that shell a test. A test is a shell made up of little sand grains or tiny bits of broken shells. And in particular, we call that a lorica if it's made of little shells. So those are little tiny pieces of shells that are broken apart that the cell will make a little house for itself. How cool is that? There's little cells, they have cilia that make little homes for themselves at the bottom of the ocean out of bits and pieces of sand and shells. And they're too small to see.
You can't even see the little hubs.
You can barely see them under a microscope. You can see them well. You can barely see them with the naked eye. They're that small. You wouldn't know it if you saw it unless you really. Video of ciliates. Ooh, differential interference contrast lighting. I used that when I was in college. Oh, it's got good music too, y'all.
About to put me to sleep.
I'll view that video.
What the heck?
What is that moving really
Look at
fast?
that resolution.
See the cilia on the edges of this thing? You can see it kind of on the edges.
Something just disappeared. Came back. Is it breathing?
Oh, you can definitely see something on this side. See that cilia?
Oh yeah.
And all these little dots that are moving around it, those are bacteria. Ooh, conjugation. This is sex. They're having sex. Ciliates having sex with one another.
Okay.
Yummy.
See, they love each other. The other ones are expecting them.
I'm shooting porn right now.
See all the little
where's the
cilia?
sex?
It's a really good video.
Where's the
They're attached to each other.
Oh, I see. There's two there.
They traded their DNA. Now they're done.
best 10 seconds of their life?
So this is at 325 times magnification. You can really see the cilia well there. See all the little bacteria in the water, all the little dots? That's what they eat.
Look at the little thing.
What's that?
You're going to see this under the microscope when we catch the plankton. Our picture won't be this good because this is a special microscope.
He's eating a lot.
Oh man, we're out of time.
I want to be
Okay,